Hello, and welcome to the Rollwise Podcast, the semi frequent unscripted show that discusses tabletop RPGs and other adjacent topics. Today's adjacent topic, we'll be talking about villains, the big bads in your game, and we're going to be just kind of seeing what is a villain? Who are our favorite villains? What can we do to maybe give you some ideas about villains in your games? And so let's start the conversation with something easy. Um, who is your guys' favorite villain and why? Or at least most memorable villain and why?
I think we discussed this before the podcast, and I don't think we agreed that it was easy. But anyways,
It's well, it could be easy. Like the funny thing about villains is, I mean, when you start like going through all the different media that you've consumed in your entire life, uh, you got villains from every which way. Um, so Brett, who would possibly be your most memorable villain and why?
Hans Gruber from Die Hard.
Okay,
I think that's a
so
good one.
Hans Gruber from Dyer. What makes Hans Gruber stand at least ahead in your mind?
Well, I think he's a good character just because of how he's written in the show. His motivations are kind of lacking. Like basically, he's just a burglar. Like that's really all he
Mhm.
wants to be. So, but he's just a good foil to John McClane's character, which I think is important for a villain. That it's a foil to the hero,
Mhm.
and he's just so serious and so I don't know German. Is that where he's from in the show?
Yeah,
Um, Something like that. But he's so serious and such a good foil for John McClane. Usually with my villains, a lot of a lot of the characters in movies that are considered the villain. If I really like the movie, a lot of times they're not necessarily. I don't think they're that villainous. Like Roy Batty
mhm.
from Blade Runner, I don't consider him. He does bad things, but I don't know if he's motivated for the wrong reasons. So
So he'd be more of a
I wouldn't call him a villain per se.
would he be the anti-villain? Because I've heard
Well,
that.
I guess, and that's another thing I think about villains is I think villains have to be like real. They have to have motivations that aren't like I hate villains that are just evil for evil's sake. Like I am the bad guy because I'm the bad guy. There isn't really a human reason as to why I'm the bad guy. I think bad guys have to have
Mhm.
like an actual reason for like usually the worst sort of evil is done because the person thinks they're doing the right thing. That's what
Mhm.
I believe, and that's I think is what a convincing villain has to have. And Roy
Okay.
Batty's a good example of that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually interesting because I was starting to dive into some videos. I was watching some YouTube the other day, and I saw something about anti-villains. And I don't think I had ever really considered. I'd always heard the term anti-hero and everything like that in terms of like literary device, like oh, they're an anti-hero. Like oh, okay, well I get kind of the anti-hero thing, but apparently it never crossed my mind that there would be such a thing as an anti-villain that kind of came to be and all that stuff. And I think Roy Batty might almost be that anti-villain, because he kind of had a sympathetic cause. I mean, he was kind of a bad guy in terms of if you just looked at what he was doing, but you didn't look at anything behind it. So I mean, I was kind of thinking that that might actually be the peg that you could put him in.
A
So.
humanized villain is I think
Mhm.
important, and I think, like I said, like everything is worse when the person doing the bad thinks they're right. Like the means justify the ends. So
Yeah. And so, okay, so we have a Hans Gruber fan in the audience. Jeff, what about you? Who's a memorable villain to you and why?
You know, I'm not great at favorites and best and memorable, but um, as I was sitting here thinking, I think that like Game of Thrones has a ton of memorable quote unquote villains. If you consider that there's a good and bad side, and not just that they're all bad, and it doesn't matter. But somebody like Littlefinger
Hmm.
or um, who is the I'm just blanking on the name, but who's the eunuch?
Oh,
The
varies.
yeah,
Hmm.
that are just they're not necessarily trying to take over the world, but they're doing their own to shape it. I mean, they're playing the Game of Thrones, if you will, but
Hmm.
Littlefinger's just out doing all these things and acting like, oh, I couldn't possibly be bad because I'm not as strong as you, and I'm not as smart as you, and I'm not as pretty as but he's amassing wealth and fortune and power behind the scenes, and nobody knows who he is, doing things through shell corporations. If we're talking, villains that have a chance to actually harm the hero, then somebody like the Joker, like where the Joker, like a lot of Batman's rogues gallery has always been.
They're very, very, very memorable villains.
They're very. Some of them are very forgettable, and they always just get beat, right? Just incredibly fast. But Joker's the only one that's ever really done a ton of harm. There's been a few others, but Joker's the one that stands out to me. That actually have a chance to change the main character's story arc, at least, right? Killing Robin,
multiple times,
crippling Barbara Gordon. Right? Yeah. Well, it's comics, but it's still. There's a lot of things that we consume now where the villains never really had a chance to ever hurt the heroes. Like they act like it and they say they can, but we never ever see it on the page or on the screen. They're kind of paper tigers.
Well, there's a lot of media where now the villain isn't necessarily the villain; they're just made to be cool.
I can see that. Do you have an example of a villain that's made to be cool off the top of your head?
I can name a bunch that are in a franchise that I don't like that I'm not going to talk about. I mean, Star Wars has a lot of villains that are made to be cool just to be cool. Like that's what Darth Maul's whole purpose, as far as I understand. For example,
he had more depth than just being cool. He had spikes and a double-ended
in a red face. Yeah. He did kung fu. You're correct.
Okay, I'm sure
and he managed to not die. So
yeah, well, and the tough part about Star Wars too is that I think that there are probably some people that would defend Darth Maul because there's probably additional comic books or books where he had a bigger role than he did in that. Whatever.
In the one movie.
And then in the one movie and stuff like that. But I get your point. In the one movie, he definitely was badass. Like, he definitely.
And that was why he was in the movie. Like, yeah. And I think there's a lot of those villains. I will say I did forget I didn't say my favorite villain of all time, and I kind of didn't think about it because you said movies. But
you can be anything.
Handsome Jack from Borderlands is maybe one of my most favorite villains in any media, just because he was the perfect blend of snarky, likable, and terrible. Like he was the perfect blend of that.
He was great. I think the thing that I liked was he didn't just have to kill. Like he didn't think that the Vault Hunters were worth his time, and so he tries to buy him out. Like he just wants them off the board. He just wants the pieces off the board. Bribery, if that works. You know what I mean? Like whatever works, he doesn't care. They don't have to die. They can come over to his side. There's multiple. It's not just I must kill you. It's Handsome Jack was a good one. I like that.
Yeah, and how he's written in the story and relates to the characters is always good. Like he's always kind of mocking you from outside, which makes you just hate him as a villain, but it's really clever, so you kind of admire it too.
Well, and then you get those peaks, and he's really actually sort of horrible and vicious,
Oh yeah, he's incredibly cruel.
he's incredibly ruthless. That's another thing. The villain has to be able to make the hard choices.
But that kind of humanization sneaks in there too. Like a lot of the stuff he does is to protect his daughter, even if he's protecting his daughter in kind of a messed up way. Like that's part of his motivation. And I think that kind of speaks to what I said before, like kind of human aspects of the villain.
Yeah. Gotcha. So that's actually pretty interesting because I was struggling. I was kind of thinking about this because I was watching an anime just last night with my wife, and it's called Code Geass, and it's a kind of over the top animation and all that kind of stuff. And the Empire of Britannia has these soldiers that are just like almost like comically bad. They pretty much see as citizens of Area 11 in the show as being like worse than dirt to be washed off their boot kind of thing, and so they just go around killing innocent people just because they're told to. They're like, just kill them. They're worthless. And all that. And I'm like, wow, that is it kind of shows a level of cruelty that you don't really see in a lot. And I've seen this anime before, so it's like one of those things where, if you haven't seen Code Geass, I would recommend it. It's a very good, if not a little wild anime. But it's definitely over the top. The villains are very villainous. They I wouldn't say that they're necessarily like one dimensional, but it's just they don't have the same kind of motivations that you or I would normally think of in a villain. They're just bad. They're like, oh, you're bad, I kill you, I don't care, you'd be nothing.
Yeah, they're bad for the sake of being bad. They're like a lot of like if you
Mhm.
watch Command, or let's say Cobra. If you watch Cobra, the Night Stalker in the movie, like
Mhm.
I mean, that's a great movie and it's fun to watch, but he isn't the best written villain because he's just bad for being bad. Like, why does he
Mhm.
murder people? Because he murders people. Well, that's not really a good motivation for the
Yeah,
character.
and it definitely kind of like mirrors some kind of authoritarian themes that you may see throughout history and stuff like that. And I mean, obviously those have got historical bases and all that. But I'd have to say though, is that the one villain that kind of stood a head and shoulder above many of the other ones, because I could probably talk about bad characters, the bad guys from a lot of different things. But did you guys ever watch any Berserk, the animation?
I didn't watch near
I
as
did
much as you
not.
did.
I read
Oh my
some of
gosh.
the manga, but I did not actually watch the
And the
anime.
more I think about it, the more villains I can think of that I
It's crazy.
absolutely adore. Like, I just remember Tulsa
Hmm.
Doom from the first
Mhm.
Conan the Barbarian. Like James
Mhm.
Earl Jones as Tulsa Doom was
Pretty good.
pretty amazing as a villain.
Well, and it's crazy because when you start thinking about it, you start going and to Jeff's point, it's like, well, there's probably a lot of villains that are not great villains. Like they're just on like Jeremy Irons, wasn't he the villain in one of the D&D movies? Like didn't he play
Yes, yes, he was. He was the evil wizard in the very first D&D movie.
And it might not have been the best villain, but when I look at like somebody like Griffith, the reason I like Griffith is because like when you watch the storyline that they played out with it, he was this white knight of this mercenary company, becomes fast friends with the main protagonist, Guts. They become inseparable, but then but you never see Griffith really growing. He's kind of in his own place this entire time while Guts continues to grow and mature. And then he starts to see that and he kind of becomes envious. So he tries to, exert control over his friend, and his friend ultimately leaves and all that. And then as soon as he leaves, he kind of falls into this depression. And you just get this whole roller coaster of emotions that culminates, and spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen Berserk, is it basically culminates in him deciding to take this egg, basically this egg that turns him into a demon god, I guess is the best way to describe it. But he sacrifices all of his friends for this power.
That's what'll happen if you eat a lot of eggs. You'll turn into
Yeah,
a
it's
demon
it's
god.
what happens when you eat a lot of eggs. And so like he basically sacrifices all of his friends in this really fantastically gory like thing. And the only people that survive this entire thing, I don't remember if in the original, it was definitely Guts and it was Casca. And I think there may have been another person or two that survived, maybe like Judo or something like that. I don't remember if there was anybody else that survived, but it was just like everybody dies for this. And then of course he's reborn as the evil Femto, and that's a really weird name. And it was just like this when you saw this entire plot arc for Griffith, you were just like, ooh, invested. It was probably one of my favorite ones.
Jeremy Irons played Profion in the D&D movie, the 2000s D&D movie.
Yeah, that was awful.
He was called Protheon.
Jeremy
Profion.
Irons looked like he was there just to cash the paycheck.
Profion. Oh yeah, he definitely was there to catch. I suggest you look up gifs of Jeremy Irons from that movie. They are all hilarious. I mean, and then I can think of some like actually really inspiring D&D villains that I have loved. Lord
Okay.
Soth.
Yeah.
He's an amazing villain. Raceland turns into an amazing villain. And we see his whole arc of him turning into a villain. Artemis Entreri from
The Driz books.
Drizzt's Foil, or Drizzt's Foil. And he's interesting because I mean he's basically an evil copy. I mean he is Driss as a human and the opposite. Like he is Drist's
Mhm.
100% opposite. He's just as good of a swordsman. He's
Mhm.
just as good at everything. He's just bad.
Yeah.
And by choice, whereas like Drist is good by choice. So that's kind of a cool villain that shows
Mhm.
that kind of being a foil to
Yeah.
the hero.
So, in terms of like, if you guys were to summarize it, like, what would be your main summary of things to consider? Like, what makes the villain in your head? It sounds like you say that there's a point of view, so there's some sort of backstory as to
Motivation.
why they're motivated to do
Yeah.
the things that
Yeah.
they do. And so the backstory comes up quite a bit in terms of like, why they do it. And I think Hans Gruber, you don't really know why he wants to do it other than like
He's actually a bad example when I
he
thought
just
about it more
he just
because he's
wants to
just greedy.
he just wants money. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, okay.
Yeah. But I think
Well, as
motivation,
a,
like he's good for an 80s action film villain, which they didn't have very
Mhm.
many backstories.
right.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say you were right. He was good as a foil.
Right.
Like as a foil in that particular plot, he
Mhm.
was fine. He didn't have any depth.
Mm.
He might have, had he lived for 9 sequels.
Yeah, he was just like a one-shot villain. Like
Yeah.
Mhm.
that's what I would use him as in like in game terms. He's a one-shot villain. He's a villain that is there for the purpose of your 6 hours or whatever you get out of your one shot. Whereas
Yeah.
a lot of the other villains we talked about are reoccurring villains or like the big
Mhm.
bad evil guy in a campaign.
Yeah. It's true. And I think that when you look at some of that stuff, that's when it becomes a little bit tricky because if you think about a backstory, if you think about their ability, like they need to be able to do bad things, like because otherwise they're not very good villains if they're just like, oh, I need to take over the kingdom, but I'm only gonna do that by waiting.
I don't know. That's a pretty insidious plan.
I'm gonna
I'm
wait till
gonna
the
wait
kingdom
until the king dies.
until the kingdom is dust and then I'll move in.
Yeah.
I mean, like that's not really like a evilness, and it doesn't really have any urgency because I think good villains have some urgency, and then
Right.
of course from their point of view that there's something that justifies their actions, even if it's a little bit like even though the logic may be hard to add up, and I think that's where we always run into some trouble is that sometimes even though like some villains almost they go into explaining the logic and you're like almost think they're worse villains because the logic was explained because you're
Right.
like, oh, that's why they're doing it.
Their logic is inherently flawed on ways that
Yeah.
like no one would make that leap of logic. But
Mhm.
unfortunately anymore I just buy it because I see people make weird leaps of logic all the time that don't make any sense.
Sure.
So
Yeah. Because I mean, I don't think I have an example off the top of my head where I remember learning the villain's motivations and I was like, oh, like that. I don't think you needed to go this route for it, but genocide, sure. I guess you could do that if we're not getting your ice cream cone, but
Well,
whatever.
yeah. Sometimes it feels like they don't really give you any clues to the motivation
Mhm.
until there's some monologuing at the end when you're at the final confrontation,
Yeah.
and then the bad guy talks about the walks in the rose garden with his grandmother, and then she died, and nobody helped her, and the
And
human
that's
race is
why.
well,
garbage, and
I don't know. There's some villains that are bad because they humanized them, like Hannibal Lecter.
Mhm.
They humanized him in the books. Like his sister got eaten by some soldiers,
Mm.
and that's what turned him into a cannibal, apparently. And
Oh.
like I read that and I was like, this is horrible because like Lecter is just he's arrogant and thinks people are shitty. That's like that's a good enough reason for him to murder people and eat them. Like they didn't need to make some like tragic story because I think sometimes what happens is there's certain elements that when you're writing about a character and if you like the character and they're a bad person, they try and heroize them in some way.
Mm.
Like books that were really bad at that, like Hannibal's kind of like Lecter, that happens to Lecter in a lot of the books where like they give him a reason for being a serial killer. And it's like, well, that really wasn't necessary. Lestat in the
Interview
Interview
with
with
a
a
vampire.
Vampire.
Yeah.
He's just a bastard in Interview with a Vampire, but they humanize him later in his books and make him more of a kind of a likable character, and he shouldn't be. Like sometimes villains shouldn't be likable in some stories. It depends on the story a little bit,
sure.
Mhm.
but like that can be a really good way to ruin a villain, I think.
Yeah, and it's well, and I mean, like the motivation, like I get it, like it's just like I get it, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh, they're just trying to get medicine for their sister. Well, are we the who's the bad guys now? Like, are we the bad guys? Because
I like the gray. I like the gray areas. I like the things that when you find out the whole truth, it sort of paints the party in a. I think it adds complexity and thought.
See, I think that's a good one. I think that's a good one. Like he's trying to cure his daughter for something is a good one because but he's doing it with these most like horror, like he has an undead army trying to get this medicine from the kingdom. Like that's like he's doing these horrible things.
Yeah, that's not okay.
That's not, and that's kind of a good motivation, I think.
So what you're saying is you did like the story arc with the guy in Alkenstar in the sewers trying.
Oh no, that he was good. That was a good. Yes, that was good. Like it made sense. He was a good villain. Like I said, I didn't
kind of almost turned the script because one of our players became the villain because then he held his daughter hostage. So he.
Yes, that was bad. Yes, and I think we all recognize that choice wasn't a good choice.
The choice may have been short-sighted.
It worked. I mean, I was a little taken aback.
No one pressed him to see if he would actually do it or not. Thank God, because that would have changed the party dynamic immensely. But no, I think that was a good character. Because he, like I said, he was doing things for a reason, and people will do horrible things if they think they're right.
Yeah,
sometimes.
And it just surprised me like how that turned out, because that's one of those situations where I was like, oh, there's many ways in which this could end.
Well, that's the same guy that said, let's have an honorable duel, and then shot the guy in the face too.
Very, very spontaneous character. I thought it was a lot of fun. I laughed so hard when he shot that.
Rule number 5 is strike first, Brent. So.
Yeah, it was great. Not when you challenge them to an honorable duel.
Well, I believe he was challenged to an honorable duel, and he responded with his own.
Yes? Question mark, and then shot him. Yeah, something like that. But no, I think that was a good character.
Yes.
Like I said, good motivations, and I think that's important when you're making a character for one of your games, is to remember sometimes it is nice to have bad guys who are just bad. Like one of the things that I would say, going back to Star Wars, is one of the reasons that I didn't like the prequels is because I didn't think anybody needed to know why Darth Vader was a bad guy. Like he just was bad. Whether it was cosmic power, like energy that made him bad or whatever, I thought that making him a good villain in that story. Humanizing him with the prequels, I think, was a bad choice because it made him seem less evil and more kind of just sad and pathetic, in my opinion. But so sometimes that's good, but I think a lot of times you need to remember, like if you're running a campaign where your characters are real characters and more fleshed out, I think you need to have more complex villains, ones with pretty human motivations. I mean, you can occasionally have like if you have like Bane from the Forgotten Realms, the god Bane, like he's just evil because he's an evil god.
Is he the god of slaughter or something like
that? Yeah, Bane is the god of strife, and like he's the Zentarium's god, so he's like strife and domination is like his thing. Whereas like there's another god that's the god of murder. And it's like they're just bad, like, and that's okay. Like they can be that way.
That's just part of their portfolio.
Yeah, and somebody who follows them might just have made that choice, and like they're okay to be those villains, but they're not. I don't think those villains are going to be your campaign style villains. Those are going to be villains that pop up, and the party takes care of.
But I still think you can have those kind of villains, and so like hear me out, right? And this is the premise of like Sauron from Lord of the Rings. Like, was Sauron a bad villain? No, I think Sauron was he was a good villain because he was just this ever-present like entity that was just kind of at the end of the thing. But what made Sauron a good villain is the fact that he had people doing bad things on his behalf, right? And so like you got Saruman, you had the Uruk-hai, you had all these different things happening because of him. And I think that that's the kind of stuff that you can really introduce into your role-playing game, and kind of transitioning to a little bit of role-playing talk is that's why I think that you make a good villain, because, when you do a one-shot, and this is where we run into a little bit of trouble. And I'll fully admit that the fact that we have 2-hour sessions makes it really hard to get a lot of momentum for any particular story arc. And it's like a skill in itself to have such a small amount of time per week to advance. a story meaningfully. Because no matter how many 30-minute episodes of stuff I watch, I always go, wow, they got a lot of shit done in that. And I look at our group and I'm like, wow, you guys talked a lot about opening that door this session.
Well, yeah, players are well, that's the difference between being able to script what people do versus having to respond somewhat to what people
Yeah.
do.
So I think it's interesting when you think about villains, because I think that there's a certain impression that they should leave on the world. And I think with, like, for example, our Fabula Ultima game, I was having a really good time. And I'll have to get your guys' opinion about this. But in the beginning, I was using a lot of the GM scenes to kind of like make the villain's presence known, and kind of without going too deep into it, is to kind of give you like that feeling like they're nipping at your heels, like, oh, they've discovered something that could lead them to your path. Oh, we've got this guy who's a bounty hunter that tracks these kind of things, and he's looking for these escapees. These are fresh tracks here, kind of thing. Because there's this giant cosmic purple lion that just got away. We got something to track here.
Right.
And so I think that was kind of an interesting thing to me, because it gave me the ability to kind of give you that impression of what was happening around you without making it so that your scene that your characters were in were being affected by the villain. How did you guys like that from a building tension, building expectations perspective?
I thought it worked from my perspective. I felt some of the tension. I got to imagine those are a lot of extra work, but I appreciated it. It gave us a glimpse into stuff that was happening off camera. That did I thought built a little bit of tension. I don't know, Brent, what did you think?
I think the tension was good. It worked at the beginning, and the tension was good. But it kind of felt like it fell off, because that was when we really started to, like, there didn't feel like there was anybody chasing us there when we were like fighting the trees and stuff. Like, we probably shouldn't have felt like we had time to do that, but it did feel like we did. But it was good at the beginning. There did feel like there was, when we were working on getting out of the town, it definitely felt like we need to be motivated to move as far away from here as possible.
And it kind of exceeded, like, and I what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to give you too many moving parts, and that's more on me, because I think I was just like, well, I just don't want to make it too complicated, because at the end of the day, I felt kind of like it was getting that Battlestar Galactica, the newest season, where it was like that first season that they put out. It was just like, okay, you jump. Okay, we've got 37 minutes until the Cylons are back. Okay, we jump again, and I feel like that's how it would have been. Is like every time I would have given you a DM scene, like, you guys were only in that forest arc for like 2 days, right? And so what meaningful change could happen, even though the problem is that took place over 4 weeks, 5 weeks, right?
For us, yeah.
So it's like, you don't want to needle it too much. And it is interesting, because I was having a hard time going, well, what do I do here? And I think that I lost momentum of that GM scene, because it just real time basically
gets in the way. Real time gets in the way.
So it was interesting, though. I was curious as to what you guys felt about it, because I really liked doing the GM scene. I got to introduce interesting characters that I felt were interesting to the story. That I was setting up a mid-level villain, for future possible fight or whatever you want to do, future overcoming. That seemed like, she was going to be a good villain. I thought she was going to be fun. Jeff's odd comments aside, those were funny. But then, I thought it was a good way to do it, and I think that that's what I really liked about doing the GM type scenes, was that it kind of, you could do some of the heavy lifting without having to put it in the scene you were currently in.
You can make it a storytelling item without railroading anybody. I think is one of the things that, like, purely narrative scenes are good at. And I think that was a good example of it. And it definitely helped the tensions. Like, once the Falcon was gone, like, once we knocked the Falcon out of the air, that was when I kind of felt like, oh, well, we can kind of relax now. And at that point, you usually have to do, like, you'd have to do something. Like, you'd have to, like, get us jumped on the road or something to make us feel like, oh no, we're still being followed, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that in a negative. Like I don't mean that in a negative way.
No,
Either.
trust me, I get it. I was kicking myself for kind of letting those GM scenes fall to the wayside. So,
but yeah, I mean and I think that's the nature of the villain. And I think when you get back to Sauron, I think the reason Sauron makes a good villain is because one, he doesn't have a backstory and he's an omnipresent kind of figure, and B, he is so much larger than the characters. Like you get into
cosmic,
you get into the underdog story. You get into the story of these little hobbits are standing up against the fiery eye in the sky who has all of the resources.
Yeah.
And that's the type of story that requires a villain like that. You don't necessarily want a villain who's humanized because he's not. Well, because the characters, the hobbits, are the human element, and the point is that he is an omnipotent, inhuman element.
But isn't he like myth though? Like, isn't Sauron more myth than like? Because I know that like, and
well, don't get me wrong,
I am not. I'm not
He's a visible eye in the sky, so no.
Well, I mean more like the backstory is kind of mythologicalized or whatever. Because I know that there was like the Silmarillion or something, and I'm not like a Lord of the Rings like deep dive person or anything like that.
I've never read the Silmarillion either.
So, but I thought they explained some of those things like the cosmic.
I mean, he does have a backstory. I mean, he did make the rings for a reason and everything, so there is a backstory present. But it not being presented in the first few books, I think, is important because that solidifies the story as like a true underdog story where it's, like I said, the hobbits are and the hobbits are written that way. They're written to be like that's one of the things that I love about the first Hobbit book that people miss is like the point of the first Hobbit book is that Bilbo should be the least capable of anybody in the entire story, and he 100% saves the dwarves every single time they're in trouble. Like he's
the trolls and
every time they're in trouble, he's the one. Like everyone forgets that like that, and that was something I hated about the first movie. Is like the dwarves were all nebbishes, like they weren't warriors; they were just miners.
If we're being fair, Bilbo's DM gave him better magic items than anybody else.
That's true.
It felt like their DM was actually like, "Oh, I can give my players magic items, and then look what they can do! Fabulous things." The guys who didn't have the magic items, they just kept getting captured.
In their defense, Bilbo did have a ring of invisibility at level 1. I guess you're right.
Minor details, just the DM behind the scenes is like, right, the one ring, you know.
So here's a funny, I don't know, this is a little bit of gaming trivia for you. So halflings in Old World 40K, original 40K fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy, I mean, they come with chaos resistance because they're basically supposed to be hobbits from Lord of the Rings. Like chaos is Saruman, and like there is a story of a hobbit that finds a ring of invisibility, and like every time you wear it, you have to test against chaos taint because that's where the story. That's part of the story of 40K.
That's funny.
Yeah,
I never knew that. Huh.
Yeah.
So I guess just to kind of wrap up this talk of villains a little bit, I think there's probably some tips that we would suggest based on what we have. And so, I mean, just to kind of summarize, have your villain have a backstory that makes sense. If you can, make sure that your villain is a foil to the characters that they're playing against.
To your heroes, yeah.
Like it doesn't make sense if the villain is like is kind of thematically not like it doesn't make sense if your players aren't interested in defeating the villain. Like if the villain's motivations aren't very interesting for your players to overcome, then I don't think that's a great villain.
And if it does happen, look around because you probably have somebody else that the players will feel is an appropriate foil, and then you just make that guy the villain.
Yeah, you just slide a hand and that guy's really the villain.
Yeah, exactly.
Make your villains active. I think make it an active villain, like where they have like, cause and like we just discussed, I think having the villain present, having them do stuff, having the players feel the repercussions of those kind of things is really important. And I think it's really interesting because, like games like Monster of the Week really have the monster doing stuff during the course of this scenario. And I think that was a really good learning lesson for me because, like when you guys had a complication, I could be like, oh, the monster shows up. Woo-hoo!
Yeah, the monster does something. Yeah.
Yeah, the monster or their minions. I mean, don't necessarily feel like the
Sure.
monster like you know, it doesn't have to be like, aha, Strahd's on scene. You could send a, you know, somebody else and do all that kind of stuff. What other things you guys think would be any other quick tips for villains based on this conversation?
I don't
Or
have
is
any
that a good
really.
summary?
I think that's a good summary.
I think there has to be a clear danger level. Like
Mm.
the threat
Yeah, he has to be a
factor
threat.
has to go up.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to be Sauron level power level, but he has to be. They have to be
A threat to the characters.
a threat
Yeah.
to the party.
Either psychologically, physically, financially, something.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even if you're starting as a level 1 character, a villain, you know, think about a villain who's like a landlord. Oh, he threatens to take away your, you know, your character's home.
Home.
You know,
Yep.
I mean that, you know, that's something that character can do because they got the magistrate on their side. You know, I
And
mean,
it's it's kind of a classic story too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, you're right. Have the threat be present so that they, you know, and they can actually have it so they can execute on the threat. Because if the person just like, I'm going to destroy the world, well, what level are you? Level 2.
Yeah, you can't even destroy the crops.
It's true.
Yeah.
And if you really want to add flair to your villains, give them monologues where they talk about fleshy vessels that are no longer needed.
That's true.
Yep, monologues are fun. So cool. So villains are fun. And honestly, I like talking about villains because I have like a list of them. I could talk about Final Fantasy VI's Kefka. You know, I could talk about Griffith all day, obviously.
Well, if people would like to hear another episode about villains, we can definitely do one. So.
And if you want to tell us who you think is the most memorable villain and why, let us know. Hit the comments. Say your villains suck. These are the villains.
Hans Gruber's terrible.
You should really think about. I don't know. I like Hans Gruber. I watch Die Hard every year, so.
No, me too.
Yeah, it's like one of my Christmas movies of choice.
It's true.
So, with that, do you guys, Jeff, do you want to send us into the
into the yond?
If you would like to get a hold of us on social media, it's at Rollwise. Look for us on Facebook, Twitter, Threads, and YouTube. And you can email us, rollwiseguys@gmail.com.
And as always, everybody, thank you for joining us. We appreciate having you here. Make some good villains. Be well. Roll wise. Roll well and roll wise. That's the first time I've ever messed that up, I think. Have a good one, everybody.
All right,
Thanks.
see you guys.